This is Be United in Leeds at CLG's listening event tackling race inequalities. I'm joined now by Suresh Pt1, Director of the Monitoring Group, which is a civil rights and community organisation. Suresh, the shape of racism is constantly changing. With all your experience, where do you perceive the challenges to be in tackling race inequalities?
It's absolutely right to say that the form of racism changes. It could be through a political change or an economic change. We don't even need to go back to the industrial society to see what kind of racism that existed at that time. If I just go to my youth, I know, for example, when racial attacks took place on black or Asian young people, the racism was never acknowledged. Victims were never provided the support they should have been, and perpetrators were never really sought and held accountable. And this society has tried to deal with some of the problems. It has dealt with the problem of racial violence because of the campaigns led by many families and communities to bring these issues to the fore. We've had murders in our country and in our capital, and as a result of the Lawrence inquiry, we've seen drastic and dramatic changes in the recording and reporting of crimes. We've seen some changes in the investigation of crimes, and we are beginning to see some amount of positive action by police and statutory and criminal justice agencies to bring perpetrators to task. But that is an uneven response. The Macpherson principles of supporting victims have been quite slow to move towards the northern cities. The Metropolitan Police came under massive amount of problems that they had to change. And over the last decade or so, since the publication of the inquiry, we've seen islands and pockets of excellence, but still in a sea of indifference and hostility. And there's also other forms of racism, not just the racism that kills, but racism that discriminates. And that has taken different shapes. We've had economic discrimination, social discrimination in housing, economic discrimination in jobs and employment. We've had discrimination, disproportionate kind of treatment in the criminal justice system, in the 1970s and 80s, and even now, unfortunately, black people are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, more likely to get an increased sentence, more likely to die in custody than their white counterparts. And we've had the changing nature of racism, not just for black migrants and black communities who came in the 50s and 60s, and they had to wage a struggle for equality, but due to the displacement of people in their own countries as a result of globalization and changes in global capital, we've had people from different countries to the shores of this, our own country, from Eastern Europe, as migrant workers, and we've seen asylum seekers from many countless countries who've suffered tyranny and civil war, traumatized by the experience, come into this country to get security and safety and build a new life for them. Unfortunately, we've seen the stigmatization of these people, the demonization of many people, and the discrimination they've suffered, or the racism that they've suffered, has been very similar to the one that my generation and my parents' generation suffered, although it's not color-coded. I think, for example, if you understand the nature and the shifts of racism because of economic problems, it becomes meaningless, for example, to talk about xenophobia as a natural hostility to strangers. I have never understood that concept. I've always been friendly to strangers, and people I know are actually quite happy to meet strangers and talk to them. So I don't think it's a natural basis of dislike or hostility to strangers. So issues of xenophobia have been created in popular culture because the media plays a very strong role in defining how new migrants are treated and how they're displayed and what notions of stereotypes are created and what myths have been created about people. I would rather talk about racism and notions of xeno-racism, which is racism as a result of displacement of people. So it doesn't matter whether you're a white Polish person coming to this country or somebody from the Caribbean or the Asian countries, you suffer that disproportionate sense. Now, what has been strengthened in this country are two things. One is there's a very strong civil society players and actors, community organizations, non-government organizations, people who work in local authorities, trade unions, people in the arts, and people in the sports who've actually gone and broken the barriers of direct forms of discrimination because they will not accept, partly because 40% of us are born in this country and we don't see an alternative. And we've also seen at certain times, and I think this is a good exercise, this event is a good example of that, where some elements of the government are beginning to say, well, actually, if we want a more democratic basis of society, then the notion of equality, specifically racial equality, is paramount to involve and integrate people.